discourse. And I love the idea of postcards because the material itself has such a diasporic quality, right? It's meant for people not from a place to send to people in a different place than where you obtain that object. And so there's this kind of constant exchange of ideas and cultural influence in terms of how people enact with that object. And also the fact that, of course, they come from different parts of time also really kind of embellish that as well. So I'm going to screen share just from my site real quick. You can kind of see the actual literature on the back, which is used to generate the text on the front. So I really want to identify colloquial phrases that may be culturally specific to where I am now, but hold maybe a different context from the time that these things were created. And so it's RMSR2 watermelon. It's just a coded thing, kind of borrowing from abstract expressionists, Reliquary-Meme series 2 watermelon. And what it depicts is Olivero Street. This postcard was produced in 1949. And usually when I find these materials, I'm always thinking about them in the context of that time first, and the context of the person who wrote these and what was going on in LA at the time, and then extrapolating things from my own narrative to try and cement that into, contemporary discourse. And so this being a year before my dad was born, I thought, heavily about his journey here. I thought that this would be a piece that kind of spoke to this idea of not only like immigration to Los Angeles, but this idea of exoticism as well from anyone who's immigrating here, wherever they come from. There's always this idea of boosterism kind of on both sides of the equation, right? Coming here and then also reminiscing to where you no longer are.
I just thought the postcard was such an interesting double entendre sort of symbol and in that way of meaning. You had mentioned, I think you mentioned something in lines with that. Is that something you've considered?
I absolutely. I mean, I think that the idea of bringing narrative to a place, right? Like a postcard typically is not meant for someone who lives in that place, right? It's meant for someone else. And so it's this kind of like unassuming mechanism in this cycle of boosterism and economic development and labor and all of this, right? It's trying to get deep. And California is like the epitome of this, right? Like there's always a gold rush every 10 years. Like it's insane. So you end up with people here, from all over the world, from all walks of life and, cultures and all those things. And when they come, I mean, it's a really kind of intimate relationship I have with the materials because it starts with reading the words of someone else always. It's never, even the words that exist on the front are never my own, really. And that's kind of what this is. It's trying to find narrative that links us rather than divides us. And thinking about how one's experience, although maybe completely, physically and chronologically separated, can still be as empathetically connected today as it ever was. And maybe I'm seeing LA in a different way, but in this sense, I think that it gives them a voice that still exists sometimes, in some cases, 100 plus years later. And for me to also be able to look back in a place that, I'm a first generation American in and say, I'm as involved in a tradition of landscape painting with these as any other kind of settler coming to a new place, right? And trying to understand a location through this articulation of environment, through this articulation of personal experience. And even like the text that you mentioned, oftentimes that's taken from, local shops. Like, I mean, this one literally from a Chinese restaurant down the street from my old place, and it's like, where does this idea of cultural representation come from? And then the kind of like pantomime behind some of that as you get into a place like LA where everyone's kind of butting up against each other.